And here we go, a look at my top 10 episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. And I think there will be quite a few surprises, some elation, some confusion, some anger at some of these choices, but these are the episodes that I feel the greatest connection to or have the greatest love for. Starting with number 10, the series finale of Star Trek The Next Generation, All Good Things. My favorite finale for any Star Trek series, in fact, my overall second favorite finale of any TV series I've ever seen. An anomaly threatens the very existence of humanity, and there are ties to the trial by Q and the Continuum, leading all the way back to the premiere Farpoint episode of Star Trek Next Generation. The plot of this finale for the series is one of the most beautiful love letters to a TV series I've ever seen, as Picard travels through time backwards and forwards, and we get a look at different eras within his existence as he tries to save humanity once and for all. And it is the perfect celebration to those previous 7 years. So remarkable how they pulled this off, and it still feels like such an incredible adventure in its own right, not just an exploration of what came before it. And it's one of those finales that leaves you in tears, but not in a sorrowful way, but in a soulful and hopeful manner, feeling the closeness to these characters, the connection that you had to this journey, and leaving things in a very happy place and knowing that things will go on to further adventures, but it doesn't leave anything feeling like a loose thread or unfinished. It feels like a true, solid, and respectful and earned ending to a journey, and someday further adventures will come, but even if things ended here, it would be the perfect final chapter in one of the greatest adventures possible. Now, after that spectacular creation of a final episode, this is going to throw people for a loop, I know. There are a couple of these choices, but kind of like my favorite episode of Star Trek Voyager is a bit of an odd one, just one that for some reason I felt connected to over time. My second favorite episode of The Next Generation, and my ninth favorite overall, number 9, from Season 5 of TNG, we have Disaster. I would be very surprised if anyone else would have this in their top 10, but pleasantly surprised because I love this episode. I don't think I've seen any episode of TNG more than Disaster. Kind of like my favorite episode of Voyager. It's a similar situation where it's one of these oddball ones that you would never guess would be a favorite. It's not like the best in the series by far. It's just a great example of a lot of the things that make me love coming to that series every week after week, and then coming back to the series year after year and decade after decade. And it's one that I very luckily recorded off TV and watched over and over again. One of those that I have on VHS and Laserdisc and will never grow tired of. An encounter with a quantum filament disables the Enterprise and leaves members of the crew locked down in various areas of the ship in a similar feeling to the Deep Space Nine episode Civil Defense, although very different cause and solution. I love the way these characters are stuck in these different situations and forced to interact, and you get to see interactions with characters that you don't necessarily see a lot of interaction with. You have on the bridge, Ro Laren is stuck with Chief O'Brien and Counselor Troy, who is the ranking officer at the time and in charge, much to Ro Laren's chagrin. And it's a good growth moment for Counselor Troy, which leads later into her taking the reins of her Starfleet career and the command path a little more seriously, and actually taking the exam and moving forward. It's an important growth point for her. as she is suddenly forced to be in a position that she is not accustomed to, or she is in charge during this disaster, and they are not in communication with the rest of the ship, so decisions are left up to her. And thankfully, she has Chief O'Brien there to help her out and explain things and stop Ro Laren from blowing up the ship. And I love all those interactions. And then you have Riker and Data trying to save the day in their plot line. And then one of my favorites is Worf is stuck in 10 forward, and this battle-hardened Klingon has the most traumatic event of his life, which comes back to haunt him later on when the O'Briens are pregnant again. He helps with the birth of Molly O'Brien in one of the funniest scenes in all of Star Trek. Just fantastic. I love everything that goes on in 10 Forward. And then the reason why, when I mention this episode, this is the one my wife would refer to as the Frere Jacques episode, Captain Picard, in another hilarious situation that is also very heartfelt and fantastic look into the character, is stuck in a turbo lift with 3 children and trying to get out of that situation, and seeing his interaction with those kids. Being a kid myself at the time, I really clung on to that scenario. And again, this is one of those that it's not one of the greatest episodes of TNG. Definitely not. I won't tell anyone who's not seen this episode. It's a good episode, but it's not like All Good Things good. But I've always had this connection to it and find it, for me, to be one of the most memorable episodes, and it's just one of those fun situations. It's not this incredible drama, it's not a huge battle, it is just the anomaly of the week type episode, and it is just the good, standard, middle of the road Star Trek that I enjoy watching over and over again. Just those I want to throw on and watch some Star Trek. That perfect type of episode, and of those types of episodes, it's probably my favorite, and definitely my favorite of that type for TNG, my second favorite in that entire series, and my 9th favorite in the franchise, if you can believe it. And my 8th favorite episode of Star Trek from Season 6 of Deep Space Nine, we have Favor the Bold. Tired of the constant retreat and being on the losing end of the war, Captain Sisko comes up with a daring plan to take back Deep Space Nine from Dominion control. And the hard part, though, is convincing the higher-ups in Starfleet that Deep Space Nine really is the most important place in the quadrant, in the galaxy right now, not Earth, not any other Federation outpost, because the connection that the Dominion has to its greatest source of power, to the rest of itself, is through the wormhole, and what controls access to the wormhole being in control of Deep Space Nine. So the heart of control for this conflict is Deep Space Nine. They need to retake it. The fleet gathers and they get ready for the attack, and the episode ends with them being faced with a far larger Dominion fleet as we wait for the decisive battle. And the greater part of the episode, though, is not just the battle to retake the station. It's actually what's going on the station, the conflict that Odo is going through with his connection to the female changeling and understanding his people, and at the same time trying to be there for Kira and everyone else who is trying to mount a resistance to free Rom from execution and stop the Dominion from taking down the minefield, which is blocking access to the wormhole, and a huge number of reinforcements on the other side, which could be the deciding factor in the war. And all of the complex relationships that are going on the station with these different characters. Kira, again, is a big focus with Ducat's obsession with her and her relationship with his daughter Torzial, and Zial's difficult position where she really is more one of them, even though she wants to believe in her father and wants him to be who she always imagined him to be, but being faced with the reality of truly who he is and the position that she's in. So you have all these complex interrelationships and these different conflicts, and the Cardassian the mounting conflict between them and their Dominion controllers, and really coming to the realization of the position that they're in. So it's all this amazing build-up, one of my favorite build-ups to a giant climactic moment, even more than the series finale in the next episode on this list. Sacrifice of Angels from Deep Space Nine's Season 6. We get the conclusion to this story. The two fleets meet, and the race to save or dismantle the minefield is on Deep Space Nine. And this contains my favorite giant space battle in all of Star Trek, even more so than in the final few episodes of Deep Space Nine, or the initial attempt to take Cardassia when the Breen showed up and ruined things. This is my favorite example of that element of Star Trek. And seeing the Defiant in action, one of my favorite starships as well, and they punch through the line. Somehow it's only the Defiant that makes it in time to see the minefield fall. Despite all their efforts, the resistance on the station failed to stop them from collapsing the minefield, and now there is an overwhelming Dominion force about to pour through the wormhole, and could be the thing that tips everything in their favor, and everyone loses to the Dominion. So what happens? The Defiant, by itself, pops into the wormhole to fight an entire fleet, or at least go down in a blaze of glory. And one of the most interesting things, try to think of the situation from the standpoint of the Dominion, especially Dukat, and just the look of shock on his face as a few moments later, the Defiant comes back out of the wormhole, and the Dominion fleet is gone. And from his perspective, the Defiant just popped into the wormhole, blew up like 1,000 ships, and came back out just fine. And just mind-blowing, and they were so assured of their victory, and to have that crushing defeat, and then having to abandon the station as the rest of the Federation Klingon Alliance fleet is arriving. They retake Deep Space Nine, and what happened was this reconnection with the Prophets, and they being of Bajor and not wanting Cisco to die as his story is not complete, pretty much just wipes out the Dominion reinforcements. It is just such an exciting, dramatic experience, this entire episode, and then the sheer joy of seeing them come back on to Deep Space Nine, and leading in then to one we talked about a bit earlier, the wedding, and some of the best episodes from Season 7. It's just such a wonderful experience, this episode. Now, number 6, a very different episode tonally, and probably the most divisive choice on this list, because it is a hit or miss episode with a lot of people. Some people love it like I do, other people can leave it and think it's not one of the best episodes, but I have this joyful appreciation for Season 7 of Deep Space Nine's Bada Bing Bada Bang. When a programming glitch has mobsters permanently taking over Vic Fontaine's club in the Holosuite, thanks to a new storyline update they installed, the gang has to take on kind of an Ocean's 11 type episode to save their favorite hangout. And as I've always said, sometimes it's these big, meaningful dramas that are the favorite. Sometimes it's the action. Sometimes it's the ones that leave you in tears because of these tremendous performances in these sorrowful situations. And sometimes, though, I just want to feel the fun and the joy and elation of being with these characters and seeing them in this type of situation, because to me it gives meaning to those more dramatically powerful moments. The great one, why do you want to see these characters make it through these tough situations, survive torture, survive battle, make it to the next day? It's the relationships that these characters have, and your connection to those relationships, and how real they feel, and these bonds that they formed. And you need to have those moments where they form those bonds to make it meaningful, and that many times takes place in some of the more playful scenarios, not always just in those harrowing moments. And especially being so late in the series and everything that these characters have gone through to this point, it feels so fun and rewarding and relaxing to have one of these moments, and it's just a lot of fun. I love seeing them in this playful element, especially when they convince Captain Sisko to join. And then one of my favorite shots in all of Deep Space Nine is right before the final act, as it begins, as their plan is ready to go and they are all dressed up and they come walking down the promenade. I love that shot, and hearing Vic and Captain Sisko sing at the end of that episode, that will stick with me forever. I think that will always bring a smile to my face, and I can hear it in my head right now just talking about the episode. I just find this to be one of the episodes that is the most fun to be with these characters. And there's only one other episode in all of Star Trek that brings a bigger smile to my face, and you have to wait a bit to get to that one. Number 5 is from Deep Space Nine's 4th season, The Way of the Warrior. This was a television event. I'm telling you, when this first came out, a giant battle, Deep Space Nine versus the Klingons, and Worf from Star Trek The Next Generation is coming to Deep Space Nine. I was losing it when this first was being shown, and I can't tell you the number of times I've watched this over and over again. You just name the format, Laserdisc, whatever, and I'm checking out Way of the Warrior. It's always going to be. It's actually, I showed Laserdisc to a friend for the first time, and I think that's what I put on was Way of the Warrior, because it's just so cool. Everything about it is just fantastic. It's not my absolute favorite battle ever. That's in Sacrifice of Angels, but it's just such an incredible experience, this episode. It's kind of hard to describe, I think, now compared to when it very first aired. I guess if you are somehow in the world of the internet able to watch Star Trek without knowing a lot of stuff going in, and it's a big surprise, this was just such a cool moment. And I know for a lot of people this marks the big turning point for them for Deep Space Nine, where it becomes a decent show into a brilliant show. For me, as you've been watching through my list, I think there are just so many individual standout episodes in those first 3 seasons that they still hold that same level of quality, so I didn't see the big jump as much, but it was a big change, and it was a huge change in the dynamic of Deep Space Nine moving forward, with Worf going over, and Worf being, this is where Worf became one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek. He was always one of my favorite characters on The Next Generation, but looking at the whole of the entirety of Star Trek, it's his growth on Deep Space Nine that made him one of my big favorites. And this is where all that began. So this was a huge moment in Star Trek history and will always be one of my favorites. Number 4, from Season 3 of Deep Space Nine, we have Explorers. And I think that this episode in particular, my discussion of why I enjoy it so much, will probably be, in many ways, the most revealing exploration of an adoration for an episode of Star Trek, and may explain even a lot of connections to the previous 96 episodes. There is an entertaining B-plot with Dr. Bashir as an old rival from his medical courses in Starfleet Academy, shows up to the station and he snubs him, although it is just she didn't recognize him, thinking that he was an Andorian the entire time. It's a funny little story, and it helps build in this early stage the character of Dr. Bashir and a little bit of his relationship with Miles O'Brien. And there are a few moments in here and lines that actually become very poignant to the story of his character many seasons later, as you find out the deep dark secret he is hiding. But really, that part of the episode is just the fun little B story. It isn't really the meat of it, and it's interesting, but has nothing to do with why I love this episode so much. That is due entirely to the main story, in which Benjamin Sisko has been slowly becoming more and more involved in the exploration of not just his role as emissary, but Bajoran culture and history and mythology, to the point where now he decides to create a replica of an ancient 800-year-old Bajoran spacefaring vessel in order to not only gather that experience and a deeper cultural understanding of the history of Bajor, but to explore an ancient myth and the idea of Bajoran travelers reaching Cardassia long before Cardassians could do such a thing, which Cardassians would, of course, suppress in their quest to appear the superior species. And he takes that moment to spend time with Jake, and it is one of my favorite, actually probably my overall favorite bonding experience. The father and son bonding moments in this episode, I think, are some of the strongest. And Sisko and his relationship with Jake, so Ben and Jake and their relationship over the years, and his role as a single father, also with this incredibly daunting career and existence as an important element of Bajoran culture, is such a difficult balance and a beautiful relationship, and one of my favorite things in all of Deep Space Nine. But that relationship holds a special importance to me, and particularly in this episode, because of real life relationships and circumstances. And as much as this episode immediately connected with me the first time I saw it, the connection grew over the next few years in rewatching it. Like TNG's Disaster or Voyager's Deadlock, this was one of the handful of episodes that I had recorded off TV on tape, and a lot of those have become favorites over time because of that ability to constantly rewatch during that formative era of growing to love Star Trek. But this in particular, because I was actually just talking to my younger sister, I'm the oldest of the three kids, the other day about this, on how the years in which Deep Space Nine aired eerily correlate to my father's slow decline into alcoholism. And that was especially a hard thing for, I think, the two of us to go through, more so than our younger sibling, who is he's a decade younger than myself and has much more, I think, of a connection to his stepfather, because he wasn't young enough to experience my father before alcohol started to be as strong of an influence. It was always there, but as strong of an influence. And I was old enough to experience the change firsthand and have that huge alteration of the relationship, to where when I was very young, I was very close to my father and did many things, just the two of us. Did things as a family, but he always kind of singled me out as the oldest child, and we did just the two of us went to museums together. Just the two of us went on camping trips. All these different things that slowly that eroded away, and I was at a fairly young age. I was at a stage where I was seeking avenues to project those natural desires for a parental figure, more specifically with my father. And some of that went to my best friend at the time, his father, a little bit, because I spent so much time with their family. And a lot of it, that connection, that familial connection and attention and personal relationships, a lot of that I projected into Star Trek of the era. Especially during the majority of this time frame, we were in a house that afforded me the space to spend a lot of time alone in a basement floor area living room where we had the family computer, and I had most of my toys and the big family TV where we would gather and watch things together as a family, but then also on my own. I spent a lot of time down there while my mom and sister were usually upstairs, and my dad would be down in his office, and that was kind of my space, even more so than my room, which, as you know, moving to the next house, being a teenager, would become my space. My memory of that house is that space, because that's where I felt the most comfort, and at that age, that's where I felt the safest. That was my safe place from any ills in the world or ills in my life, was in that basement watching Star Trek. That's where everything that was in any way negative dissolved, and I felt the most positivity towards not just the moment, but looking towards the future. And that's why Star Trek was also so important, the message of this greater future, and striving to be your better self, and striving for equality, and all those elements were hugely influential on who I was developing to be as a person, and my morality and my outlook, and how I want to be a positive influence in things going in that direction. It was a huge part of who I was in those formative years. But the biggest thing was the projection of looking for that paternal relationship, and I projected that very strongly on to Ben Sisko, very, very strongly, as that. Just for some reason at that time, I mentally projected myself as being Jake Sisko many times. I have very vivid memories of, in a way, sitting there watching, pretending I was Jake. And this episode in particular, in rewatching it, and because it was such a powerful moment for that father-son bonding and that experience on that solar ship, on that Bajoran vessel, that it felt like a powerful personal experience, to where at that age, for me, rewatching that episode felt like being back on a camping trip with my dad. And that has truly stuck with me in the preceding just about 30 years since this episode first came out. But Star Trek was such a powerful influence on my life, and continues to be, and always will be. But that specific connection to Commander, then Captain Sisko, to Benjamin Sisko at the time, and that projection of that fatherly relationship was very strong for me. And this episode continues to be the greatest example of that. Number 3 from Season 6 of DS9, we have In the Pale Moonlight. And over the course of this series, if you have stuck with me the whole time, and thank you for doing so, I hope you've been enjoying it up to this point. I think you've come to an understanding, especially after that last one, about how important the character of Benjamin Lafayette Sisko is to me. And this episode I consider to be Avery Brooks's best performance as that character. Some of the greatest monologues in Trek history. If it really comes down to it, Avery's performance in this episode is my favorite acting performance in all of Star Trek. Just brilliant. The entire thing is structured around Captain Sisko making an entry in his log recounting the events leading up to how he goaded the Romulans to join the Dominion War on the side of the Federation and the Klingons. And it enters such a heart-wrenching and realistic and complicated and violent moral gray area that it just enters territory that Star Trek very rarely dares to go, and it's done in such a manner that is one of the most compelling hours of television ever produced. The Federation, even allied with the Klingons, is on the losing end of the war at this point. Things are just not going well, and even some important planets like Beta have fallen, which leads to one of the best TNG era books from the Dominion War, with the fall of Beta, and the losses just keep mounting, and the one big force that could help balance this war effort would be the Romulans, one of the largest powers in the Alpha and Beta Quadrant, that have kept themselves largely outside of the war with the Non-Aggression Pact. They are trying to bide their time, especially after the failed effort of the Tal Shiar's collaboration with the Obsidian Order. The Romulans are trying to bide their time and kind of wait out this conflict, trying to come out of it as unscathed as possible, and then be a remaining superpower in the aftermath, hoping the Klingons and the Federation and the Dominion just beat the heck out of each other to the point where they are sitting pretty in a position of power in the aftermath of this conflict. So what Captain Sisko very desperately has to do is figure out a way to convince them that it is in their best interest to join the side of the Federation and to enter this war effort immediately. And how he has to do that is one of the greatest personal conflicts that you see him work through his mind as he makes this log entry and as he tries to look back over this process and his thought process and how things evolved. And one of the greatest conflicts of do the ends justify the means that I've ever seen. It's just so well written and performed. Everything about this episode to me is just pure perfection. It's just one of the greatest performances in television history, not even just outside of Star Trek. I think it's so unbelievably perfect and was breathtaking when this first came on. I couldn't believe how brilliant this episode was, and to this day has remained one of my favorite episodes in all of Star Trek. Only two things beat it out. Number 2, my second favorite episode, a two-parter in all of Star Trek from TNG's third and then fourth season. We have The Best of Both Worlds. This was a massive game changer for Star Trek as a franchise. It had a big effect on television as a whole, and it's just a brilliant and compelling story in its own right. And the reason why it is so high for me, my second favorite episode, is because this is the thing that made me fall in love with Star Trek. This is actually the first episode that I remember seeing live. I was very young, and it's actually one of my earliest memories. I vividly remember being in the living room of our old apartment above a gas station before we had our first house, and I remember I could picture everything so vividly, and sitting there and watching this and just being terrified of the Borg and what was happening to Captain Picard as he was Locutus, and not comprehending why I had to wait to see the ending of the story. I couldn't just, Mom, turn the page kind of thing, reading a bedtime story or put in the next tape. Like, I had to wait. And that experience of watching that for the first time had such a profound effect that it immediately made me, at such a young age, obsess over Star Trek. And I can't exaggerate the importance of that, considering how huge of a factor in my entire life Star Trek has been. From an early age, it was the Scholastic magazine in elementary school, getting all the Star Trek kids books and video games, and Star Trek toys were the number one thing that I wanted. Star Trek that was my step into then reading more adult books as a little kid. Star Trek was a huge thing from this moment, from this time when I was around like 4 years old, seeing this episode, to now I'm crawling ever closer to 40 and turning to dust. It single-handedly had the power to put me on a path to where this franchise was such an important element of my existence, and just the experience of it over and over again. It's such a brilliant drama, all the risks that they took, and it's fantastic. It's one that, I don't get too much into the plot of this one as I have with lots of other ones, because it's just so well known, and it's more the what it did for me and to me than as the actual episode, even though it is brilliant in its own right. And what it is, it's more the power of the experience that puts it so high on the list. And it is a two-parter that I come back to and watch at least once a year in some form or another, because it is such an important moment in my early life, and it is the catalyst for being such a super fan of this franchise. One of the reasons behind the creation of the Star Trek Voyager episode Flashback, which also made it earlier onto this list, was to help celebrate the 30th anniversary of Star Trek as a franchise, using elements from the original series, A Connection, and Deep Space Nine did their own tribute, and that turned out to be my number one favorite episode in all of Star Trek. And when it comes right down to it, it's probably my favorite episode of all television, just in general. I cannot express in words how much I love this episode. Trials and Tribulations from Season 5 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. My single favorite episode in all of Star Trek, the entire franchise. I watch this episode multiple times a year, every year, and love every second of it every single time just as much as I did the first time. Deep Space Nine gets a visit from Temporal Investigations to interview Captain Sisko, and he has to recount the adventures of the Defiant as it went back in time and took part in the events of the original Star Trek episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, which is one of my favorite episodes of the original series. And if you've been watching this list, you know I like a lot of these newer Star Trek ones where they have a connection to the original series. Episodes like A Mirror Darkly, Flashback from Voyager. And this is the greatest example of that, because they, in one of the greatest visual wizardry that I have ever seen, it still looks incredible. They put themselves in the episode, combination of putting themselves into footage, rebuilding sets and filming things and matching things so perfectly. You get to see them take part in one of my favorite original series episodes with their own adventure. And this, to me, is the most fun and joyful episode of all Star Trek. The perfect balance of being a tribute to the original series while still being very true to being a great Deep Space Nine episode. And one of my favorite parts was Dax, one of my all-time favorite Star Trek characters, having such a fun, nostalgic experience as she actually lived through this time period. It was really cool to see that, and I think Terry Farrell pulled off that feeling to where you truly believed that this was a character that was returning to another place and time that she actually lived through and experiencing that fun nostalgia. You can't help but feel that yourself. Enjoyable portrayal of the characters and their relationships. It is every second of this thing is dripping with everything that makes me adore Star Trek. And I still think to this day it is one of the most astounding accomplishments in Star Trek history. What they pulled off with this episode is incredible. I love it. It's my favorite episode in all of Star Trek, the entire franchise. We finally come to the end, 3+ hours later. This was a huge undertaking, this list. Thank you very much for everyone who joined me and watched the entire thing, and everyone who helped keep me motivated by being excited by the concept of this and the idea. That's one thing I really hope for. I like to, my theory, my way of producing this kind of content is, the thought process is to create the kind of stuff that I would like to watch. And this sort of deep exploration of an entire franchise like Star Trek is the kind of thing that I would love to watch, much more than, some people sit and watch hours of a sports event or game shows or whatever. This is the kind of thing that would interest me, so that's why I created it and did it in a manner to which none of these were scripted, literally not a word was written for any of these videos. I had my list and I just looked at the titles of episodes and started talking, and then edited some things down when it went on too long. Tried to stay pretty consistent with the length of each one of these episodes, and it was a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed the whole process. It was a very personal and introspective way of exploring this franchise, rather than just kind of trying to figure out what I think are the technical best episodes. Try and putting a lot more personal enjoyment and meaning into them and listing them out that way, and kind of figuring that out. And that was hard to do, and a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And for me, it was almost like a therapeutic process, looking, because I've never really listed out favorite episodes of Star Trek before, just going through and thinking in depth about all of these and coming up with this list. And especially as we got higher up, it was something that helped to also very much drive home for myself why this franchise is so important to me, and why I spend so much time with it and talking about it and exploring it. So it was a fantastic experience for me to create these, and I hope it was a good experience for you to explore them and enjoy them. And of course, I would love to hear what a lot of your favorite episodes are of Star Trek. That's one of the big hopes for this series, is that it creates a lot of comments down below, because I would love to see what people think, what some of their favorites are, and reactions, even if they're negative to some of the surprises and some of my choices and opinions. Just kind of cool to have a venue to very openly talk about something that I'm so passionate about. That's one of the positive sides of the internet and things like YouTube. So thank you for joining me for this massive series. If you know anyone else who will be interested and hasn't checked these out and you enjoyed it, let them know. And your normal average 3-minute per episode programming will continue tomorrow. I will see you back tomorrow. I'll see you every day for a little bit of Star Trek love. I hope you're enjoying the Trek-A-Day channel so far, and I'll see you again tomorrow.